Akiko stood in the narrow space behind the heavy curtain, her small body trembling just a little. The air backstage smelt like old dust and electric cables, a sharp smell that tickled her nose. She clutched her music folder against her chest, holding it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The folder was battered and old, the corners bent from years of use, but it was her most precious possession. Inside were the songs she knew by heart, the songs she had practiced thousands of times in her small apartment back home. She was only 10 years old, and in this giant building in a big American city, she felt incredibly small. The hallway outside was buzzing with noise. People were walking back and forth, tuning instruments and talking loudly. Some were stretching their arms, some were drinking water, and some were laughing. But Akiko just stood still, pressing her back against the cold wall. She looked down at her shoes. They were black and shiny, polished by her father that morning. They were the best shoes she owned, but on the cold floor of the theater, they looked very plain to her. Her father, a quiet man with kind eyes and tired shoulders, was standing a few feet away. He was looking at a piece of paper in his hands, frowning slightly as he tried to read the English words printed on it. He had worked very hard to bring her here. He had taken extra shifts at the convenience store where he worked, staying late into the night stacking shelves so that he could pay for the plane tickets and the entry fee. Akiko watched him. She saw the gray hairs mixed in with his black hair and the way he rubbed his neck when he was stressed. She knew how much this meant to him. She knew how much it meant to her mother, who had stayed behind to take care of her grandmother. Akiko felt a heavy weight in her stomach. It wasn't just nerves, it was the fear of letting them down. She wanted to win. She wanted to show them that their hard work was worth it. But looking around at the other children, she felt a wave of doubt crash over her. The other contestants looked so confident. There was a boy with a violin who was walking around like he owned the place. He had a fancy suit and his hair was perfectly combed. There were girls with long dresses who were chatting and laughing, their American accents fast and smooth. They belonged here. Akiko looked at her own reflection in a dark glass panel on the wall. She wore a simple white blouse and a black skirt. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid. She looked neat, but she looked different. She stood out, and not in a way that made her feel brave. Suddenly, the door to the main hall opened and a wave of noise floated out to them. Akiko flinched. She could hear the voice of the man on the stage. It was the head judge. He had a deep, booming voice that echoed even through the thick walls. But it wasn't just his voice that made her freeze. It was the sound that followed. He laughed. It was a loud, mocking laugh. Then the audience laughed with him. Akiko's heart sank. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could hear the tone. It was the sound of people being cruel. A few moments later, the door opened again, and a young boy walked out. He was holding a cello. His head was down and his face was red. He was trying not to cry, but his lips were shaking. He walked past Akiko without looking up, rushing to find his parents. Akiko looked at her father. He had heard it too. The smile on his face faded, replaced by a look of worry. He walked over to her and crouched down so he was the same height as her. He reached out and gently fixed the collar of her blouse. "Do not listen to them," he said softly. His English was broken and slow, but his voice was warm and steady. "You play your music. You play your heart. That is all that matters." Akiko nodded, but she couldn't find her voice to speak. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to be strong, but the judges sounded scary. From the snippets of conversation she heard earlier in the hallway, she knew they didn't have much patience. They wanted to be entertained. They wanted something flashy and fast. They didn't want to listen to a shy girl from far away who spoke very little English. She peeked around the side of the curtain. The stage was huge and bright. Spotlights cut through the darkness like lasers. In the middle of the stage sat a large black grand piano. It looked beautiful and terrifying all at once. It was waiting for her. Behind a long table in the center of the room sat the judges. Even from this distance, she could see their body language. The man in the middle was leaning back in his chair, looking bored. The woman next to her was checking her watch. They looked like they were waiting for a bus, not waiting to hear music. "The next contestant is Akiko Tanaka," the announcer's voice rang out. Akiko felt her legs turn to jelly. This was it. Her father stood up and squeezed her shoulder. His hand was big and warm. "Go," he said. Akiko took a deep breath. She pulled her shoulders back and tried to look tall. She stepped out from the safety of the curtain and into the bright light. The walk to the piano felt like the longest walk of her life. The floor was slippery, and she had to concentrate hard not to trip. As she walked, she could feel hundreds of eyes on her. The audience was quiet now, waiting to see what she would do. When she finally reached the piano, the light was so bright she had to squint. She couldn't see the audience anymore, just a wall of darkness. But she could feel them. She could feel the judgment hanging in the air. She adjusted the bench, struggling for a moment to move it because it was heavier than it looked. A few people in the crowd giggled at her struggle. Akiko felt her face get hot. She sat down on the bench and placed her feet on the pedals. Her feet were so small that she had to stretch to reach them. She looked up towards the judges' table. The head judge was looking at her over the rim of his glasses. He didn't look friendly. He tapped his pen on the table, a slow, rhythmic sound that seemed to mock her. He whispered something to the woman next to her, and she let out a short, sharp laugh. Akiko gripped the edges of the bench. She felt tears stinging the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I am not a joke," she told herself. "I am not here to be laughed at." She thought about the late nights, the cold winters, the silence of her room filled only with the sound of her playing. She thought about her father's tired smile. She opened her folder and looked at the music, though she didn't need to. She knew every note. She placed her shaking hands on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth under her fingertips. It was the only thing in this strange, loud place that felt familiar. It was her friend. She closed her eyes for just a second, blocking out the lights, blocking out the judges, blocking out the fear. She was ready. Akiko sat on the black bench, her feet dangling just slightly above the floor. She had to stretch her legs to reach the gold pedals. It was an uncomfortable position, but she was used to it. Back home, she practiced on an old upright piano that had seen better days, and she had to use a wooden box just to reach the pedals there. Here, in this grand hall, everything was huge. The ceiling was so high it felt like the sky inside a building. The curtains were a deep, crushed red velvet that looked heavy and expensive. And the piano was shiny, so polished that she could see her own small reflection staring back at her in the black paint. She took a deep breath and tried to steady her hands. They were resting on her lap, hidden from the bright lights. She could feel her heart beating hard against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. It was so loud in her own ears that she wondered if the people in the front row could hear it too. The silence in the room was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a waiting silence, the kind that happens just before something breaks. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath, but not in a good way. It felt like they were waiting for her to fail. She looked up toward the long table where the judges sat. The lights were bright in her eyes, making it hard to see their faces clearly, but she could see their shapes. The man in the middle, the one with the silver hair, was leaning back in his chair. He looked relaxed, too relaxed. He was holding a pen, tapping it rhythmically against a thick stack of papers on the desk. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed in the quiet room. To Akiko, it sounded like a countdown. To his left sat a woman with very short hair and sharp glasses. She wasn't looking at Akiko. She was looking at her watch, then up at the ceiling, then back at her watch. She looked bored. She looked like she had better places to be. On the other side was a younger man with a beard. He was scrolling through his phone, the blue light from the screen reflecting on his face. He wasn't even trying to hide his disinterest. Akiko felt a sharp pain in her chest. She had practiced for this. She had given up her weekends, her TV time, her time with friends. She had played until her fingers hurt and her back ached. She had poured her soul into the music. But to these people, she was just a number on a list. She was just a 10-year-old girl taking up 5 minutes of their time. The man in the middle stopped tapping his pen. He leaned forward, shifting his weight. The chair squeaked loudly, cutting through the silence. He picked up the microphone that sat on the table. The feedback screeched for a second, making everyone in the audience cover their ears. Akiko flinched. It was an awful sound. "Okay, let's keep this moving," the man's voice boomed through the speakers. It was deep and loud, filling every corner of the hall.
We have a long schedule today. Let's try not to make it any longer than it needs to be." A few people in the audience chuckled. It was a low, quiet laugh, but to Akiko it sounded like thunder. She felt her face get hot. She gripped the edge of the piano bench with her hands. Her palms were sweating. The judge looked down at his paper, squinting like he was trying to read something very small. "Akiko Tanaka," he said, butchering the pronunciation of her last name. He said it slowly, stretching out the syllables in a way that made it sound silly. "Tanaka. Is that right? Okay, then." He looked up, peering over his glasses. His eyes were small and beady. "Now, I understand you're traveling from quite a ways away. That's nice, but we are looking for a very specific level of proficiency here. This isn't a school recital, all right?" He didn't say it meanly exactly, but his tone was sharp. It was the voice a grown-up uses when they talk down to a child. It was the voice of someone who has already made up their mind. The woman with the short hair let out a loud sigh and flipped a page in her notebook. "So, whenever you're ready," the silver-haired man said, leaning back again and crossing his arms over his chest, "please do try to keep it interesting. We've heard a lot of Mozart today." The audience laughed again. This time it was louder. It was a laugh that said, "She's in trouble now." It was a laugh of dismissal. Akiko felt her face get hot. She gripped the edge of the piano bench with her hands. Her palms were sweating. She remembered what her father told her backstage, "You play your heart." She opened her eyes and looked down at the keys. They were white and black, orderly and clean. They didn't judge her. They didn't care where she was from or how old she was. They only cared about the pressure she put on them. They were her safe place. Akiko reached out and placed her sheet music on the rack. It was a precaution, really. She knew the piece by memory. She had played it 1,000 times in her dreams, but having the paper there made her feel a tiny bit more secure, like a shield. She smoothed out the pages with her hand, taking an extra second to compose herself. The judge sighed loudly, a long, dramatic exhale that was meant to rush her. "We don't have all day, sweetheart," he said. The word sweetheart didn't sound kind. It sounded like a weapon. It stung. Akiko ignored him. She blocked out the noise of the shifting audience. She blocked out the whispers. She focused entirely on her hands. She flexed her fingers, feeling the tension in her joints. She imagined she was back in her living room. The walls weren't grand, they were just painted wood. The lights weren't spotlights, they were just the warm lamp in the corner. The judges weren't important people, they were just empty chairs.
She sat up straighter. She pulled her shoulders back. The fear was still there, sitting heavy in her stomach like a stone, but she pushed it down. She pushed it down deep. She wasn't here to impress them anymore. She was here to play. She was here to show them who she really was. Akiko took one last deep breath, filling her lungs with the dusty air of the theater. She lifted her hands off her lap. They were still shaking, just a little bit, but her grip was firm. She hovered her fingers over the keys, searching for the starting position. C sharp, F sharp, A. The notes were vivid in her mind. The room went quiet again. Even the man with the phone looked up, perhaps sensing that she was finally about to start. The silver-haired judge uncrossed his arms, ready to write something negative, ready to check another box off his list. He expected something simple. He expected something childish. He expected a reason to laugh again. Akiko didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead at the music stand, but she wasn't reading the notes. She was seeing the story the music told. It was a story of strength, of rising up, of fighting back against the dark. It was perfect for this moment. She lowered her fingers. The silence stretched for one heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, and then her fingertips touched the piano. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the sound that came out wasn't soft or gentle. It was sharp, like a crack of lightning. Akiko didn't start with the slow, quiet melody that everyone expected from a young girl in a pretty dress. Instead, she hit the keys with a sudden burst of energy that startled the entire room.
The first chord rang out, clear and loud, bouncing off the high ceilings and shaking the dust in the air. The heads of the judges snapped up. The silver-haired man, who had been half asleep with his pen hovering over his paper, nearly jumped out of his chair. The woman with the sharp glasses stopped checking her watch instantly. The man scrolling through his phone dropped his device onto the table with a loud clatter. It was as if someone had screamed fire in the middle of a library. The silence was shattered, replaced instantly by a sound that demanded respect. Akiko's hands moved fast, very fast. She was playing a complex piece, a song that was full of difficult runs and jumps. Her right hand flew up and down the keyboard, her fingers moving like they were possessed by their own energy. To anyone watching, it looked impossible. Her hands were small, yet they stretched and moved with the speed of a hummingbird's wings. The notes weren't just played, they were attacked. She leaned into the piano, her body swaying back and forth. She wasn't sitting stiffly anymore. The fear that had frozen her shoulders just moments ago was gone, melted away by the heat of the music. Her eyes were closed tight, shutting out the bright lights, shutting out the judges, shutting out the world. All she could see was the music in her mind. She could see the colors of the notes, bright reds for the loud parts, deep blues for the low, rumbling bass notes. The piece she was playing was famous for being difficult. It required strength that most 10-year-olds just didn't have. But Akiko had that strength. She had built it up over years of practice, while other kids were playing video games or watching cartoons. Every note was precise. There was no mumbling through the hard parts. She played every single note clearly, even when her fingers had to cross over each other in complicated patterns. In the first few seconds, the laughter in the room had died completely. The few people in the audience who had been giggling or whispering were now dead silent. You couldn't hear a single cough or a shuffle of feet. The only sound in the giant hall was the roar of the grand piano. It filled the space, drowning out the awkwardness, drowning out the judgment. It was a wall of sound, and it was beautiful. The silver-haired judge leaned forward, his mouth opening slightly. He looked at his papers, then back at the girl. He couldn't find what he was looking for. He was ready to write weak or timid, but he couldn't do it. He realized very quickly that he had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't a school recital. This was a master class. He put his pen down slowly, his eyes narrowing as he watched her hands. He was trying to figure out how she was doing it. He was looking for a mistake, a slip, a missed note, but he couldn't find one. The music shifted. The fast, chaotic opening settled into a rhythm that was driving and powerful. It sounded like an army marching or a heart beating wildly. The bass notes on the left side of the piano were heavy and deep, vibrating through the floorboards. Akiko's left hand was just as busy as her right, keeping a steady, rock-solid beat, while her right hand danced on top of it. She played with an intensity that was scary for someone so small. Her face was serious, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't smiling. This wasn't a performance for fun. This was a battle. She was fighting the prejudice that hung in the air like smoke. She was fighting the idea that she was just a child. She was fighting the laughter that had tried to belittle her. And with every press of the keys, she was winning. The audience began to lean in. People in the back rows stood up slightly, craning their necks to see the small girl behind the massive instrument. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The sound was huge, much bigger than the girl playing it. It was as if the piano had come alive and was telling a story all its own, and Akiko was just the vessel, the tool it was using to speak. The judge with the phone didn't pick his device back up. He stared, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of grudging respect appearing on his face. He knew music. He knew how hard this piece was. He knew that adults struggled to play it with that kind of clarity. Seeing a child do it was shocking. It humbled him. The bored woman with the glasses had taken her glasses off and was rubbing her eyes as if she couldn't trust what she was seeing. Akiko's fingers moved to the higher end of the keyboard. The notes became lighter, like sprinkles of water, but they were still fast. They trickled down the scales like rain, no, like a waterfall. It was a rushing sound that made you hold your breath. Then she crashed her hands down the keyboard, a long, dramatic glide that ended in a deep, booming chord at the bottom.
The vibration shook the bench she sat on, but she didn't stop. She didn't pause to catch her breath. The music kept flowing, relentless and powerful. She was sweating now. A small drop of sweat rolled down her temple, but she didn't wipe it away. She didn't dare stop. She was in the zone, a place where time didn't exist. There was only the next note, and the next, and the next. She played with a kind of anger that she usually kept hidden inside. It was the anger of feeling small, the anger of being laughed at, the anger of not being understood, but she turned that anger into something beautiful. She didn't use words to yell at them, she used music. She was screaming at them with the piano, and the sound was magnificent. The complexity of the song was staggering. Her hands were doing two different things at the same time. The left hand was playing a slow, sad theme, while the right hand was playing a fast, joyous melody over it. It was a mix of happiness and sorrow, all tangled together. It was the story of her life, in a way. The joy of playing, the sadness of missing home, the pressure of the competition. It was all there in the music. The judges were now fully awake. The silver-haired man had scooted his chair closer to the edge of the table. He was no longer the bored, cynical critic. He was a listener. He was captivated. He tapped his foot gently to the rhythm, unable to help himself. The music was too strong to resist. It pulled you in. It made you feel something. Akiko's fingers were starting to hurt, but she didn't care. The adrenaline rushing through her body acted like a shield against the pain. She felt powerful. For the first time since she walked onto that stage, she didn't feel small. She felt giant. She felt like she could touch the ceiling with her music. The piano was an extension of her body, an extra voice that she could finally use to speak her mind, and the world was finally listening. The laughter was gone, eaten up by the sound of the keys. In its place was a stunned, awe-filled silence that wrapped around her like a cloak. The frantic energy of the opening began to fade, transforming into something much deeper and heavier. Akiko's hands, which had been flying across the keys like angry birds, slowed down. The loud, crashing chords stopped, replaced by soft, delicate notes that hung in the air like smoke. The silence that had been shocked into the audience now turned into a different kind of quiet. It wasn't just shock anymore, it was awe. People were leaning forward in their seats, afraid that even breathing too loud might break the spell. Akiko's eyes were still closed, but her face looked different now. The look of determination and anger was gone, replaced by a look of deep sadness. She wasn't fighting the music anymore. She was letting it carry her. She played a melody that was so simple and so pure that it hurt to listen to. It was the sound of loneliness. It was the sound of a child sitting in an empty room while her parents worked late. It was the sound of missing a home that was thousands of miles away across the ocean. She pressed the keys gently, caressing them as if they were the face of a loved one she hadn't seen in years. The piano sang back to her, a vibrating, warm tone that filled every corner of the hall. The acoustics in the building were perfect for this. The sound swelled, wrapping around the audience like a thick blanket. For the first time, the judges weren't looking at their watches or their papers. They were staring at the small girl on the bench, completely mesmerized. The silver-haired judge sat back in his chair, but he wasn't relaxed. He was tense, his eyes fixed on Akiko. He had judged thousands of musicians in his long career. He had heard technical perfection many times. He had heard fast fingers and loud music. But this was different. This wasn't just about hitting the right notes. This was about telling a story.
He realized with a sudden jolt that he wasn't hearing a performance, he was hearing a confession. He was hearing this girl's heart pour out through the strings of the piano. He felt a strange tightness in his own chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. The cynicism he wore like armor was cracking. Akiko's left hand began to play a low, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. It was slow and heavy. Over the top of it, her right hand played notes that were higher and brighter, but they wavered slightly. It wasn't a mistake, it was emotion. She played with a vibrato that made the notes tremble, like a voice holding back tears. The music was asking a question without using words. Why am I here? Why is it so hard? Do you see me? The woman with the sharp glasses wasn't looking bored anymore. Her mouth was slightly open, and her hand was resting over her heart. She expected a nursery rhyme. She expected a clumsy attempt at a simple song. Instead, she was hearing a masterpiece. She saw the way Akiko swayed with the music, the way her small body moved in perfect harmony with the instrument. The piano wasn't sitting on the bench. She had become part of the piano. It was a connection that went beyond physical touch. It was spiritual. In the audience, a few people wiped their eyes. The music was universal. You didn't need to speak English or Japanese to understand what Akiko was saying. She was talking about pain and hope and the strength it takes to keep going when you feel like giving up. Every person in that hall had felt that at some point in their lives. They heard their own sadness in her melody. Akiko's mind was far away from the theater. She was imagining the small apartment she lived in back home. She could see the peeling wallpaper and the small window that looked out on a busy street. She could see her mother's tired face smiling at her over a bowl of rice. She could feel the weight of her father's hand on her shoulder. She poured all that love and all that worry into the keys. She played for the sacrifices her family made. She played for the long nights and the early mornings. She played to prove that every struggle was worth it. The music began to build again, slowly rising like a tide coming in. The soft notes became louder. The sadness turned into strength. The rhythm became faster, more urgent. Her hands moved in sync, mirroring each other, climbing up the scale together. The sound grew fuller, richer. It was no longer a whisper, it was a declaration.
The judge on the end, the one who had been on his phone, had completely forgotten about it. The screen had gone black, but he didn't notice. He was watching Akiko's fingers. They were moving with incredible speed and precision, but it wasn't just a show of skill. There was purpose behind every note. He marveled at the control she had. To go from such a loud, chaotic beginning to such a soft, sad middle, and then to build it back up again, required a maturity that was rare in adults, let alone a child. Akiko's body was rocking intensely now. The music was sweeping her away. She felt a surge of power go through her. The fear of the judges, the memory of their laughter, it all fueled her. She took that negativity and turned it into energy. She hit the keys harder, driving the melody forward. The sound was triumphant. It was the sound of someone standing up after being knocked down. It was the sound of a voice saying, "I am here." The silver-haired judge found himself holding his breath. The music was heading toward a climax. He could feel the tension rising in the room. It was like watching a storm gather on the horizon. He knew what was coming, but he didn't know how she would handle it. The ending of this piece was notoriously difficult. It required a burst of speed and power that exhausted even the best players. He watched her face. It was set in a mask of fierce concentration. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She was giving it everything she had. The volume increased. The piano was roaring now, filling the huge space with sound waves that you could feel in your chest. The bass notes thundered, shaking the floor. The high notes screamed like a bird of prey. It was chaotic and beautiful, a swirling storm of sound. Akiko's hands were a blur. She was playing at the absolute limit of her speed. She was pushing the piano to its limit. The audience was frozen. No one moved. No one blinked. It was as if the entire room had been lifted off the ground and was suspended in the air by the music. The judges were gripping the edge of the table. The silver-haired man had completely dropped his act. He wasn't judging anymore. He was witnessing. He knew that he would remember this moment for the rest of his life. He realized that he had been wrong, terribly, horribly wrong. This girl wasn't a joke. She was a prodigy. She was an artist. Akiko's body was rocking intensely now. The music was sweeping her away. She felt a surge of power go through her. The fear of the judges, the memory of their laughter, it all fueled her. She took that negativity and turned it into energy. She hit the keys harder, driving the melody forward. The sound was triumphant. It was the sound of someone standing up after being knocked down. It was the sound of a voice saying, "I am here." The final chord seemed to hang in the air like a heavy cloud, vibrating through the floorboards and the walls. It was a massive sound, one that filled every corner of the giant hall. Akiko held her hands down on the keys, pressing them deep into the ivory to sustain the note for as long as possible. Her chest was heaving up and down. She was out of breath, as if she had just run a long race. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it pounding against her ribs. Then, slowly, she lifted her hands. The moment her fingers left the keys, the sound began to fade, melting away into the silence of the room. Akiko pulled her hands back to her lap and sat up straight. She smoothed her skirt with her trembling palms, a nervous habit she had. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the quiet of boredom from before. It was the quiet of shock. It was the kind of silence that happens when something so beautiful and unexpected occurs that nobody knows how to react immediately. Akiko kept her head down for a second, looking at the dusty pedals of the piano. She was scared to look up. For a brief moment, the doubt crept back in. Had it been enough? Did they still see a little girl in a too-big blazer? Did they still see a joke? The echoes of their laughter from earlier were still fresh in her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sound of a pen clicking, or a bored sigh, or a polite clap that meant, "Please go away." But then it happened. From the very back of the hall, a single man stood up. He was an older man, a stranger who had come to listen to the music. He didn't clap politely. He slammed his hands together, once, twice, 3 times. The sound was sharp and broke the spell. Like a dam breaking, the rest of the audience followed him. First one row, then the next, then the entire room. The noise started as a rumble and then exploded into a roar. It wasn't just clapping, people were shouting. A woman near the front let out a loud cheer. A man whistled loudly through his fingers. The sound was deafening. It washed over Akiko like a warm wave.
Her head snapped up and her eyes went wide. She saw hundreds of people standing up. The dark hall was now a sea of moving bodies, all facing her, all making noise for her. The applause was so loud it made her ears ring. They weren't just being nice, they were moved, they were ecstatic. Akiko's eyes quickly darted to the judge's table. She saw something she would never forget. The silver-haired judge, the man who had mocked her name and tapped his pen in boredom, was standing up. He wasn't just standing, he was clapping hard. His face was red, and his glasses had slipped down his nose. He wasn't looking at his papers or the clock. He was looking right at her, and there was a smile on his face, a real smile. It was a look of pure amazement. The woman with the sharp glasses was also standing. She had taken her glasses off completely and was wiping her eyes with a tissue. Even the young judge, who had been on his phone, was on his feet, clapping his hands above his head. He was nodding at her, a gesture of deep respect. The 3 people who had treated her like she didn't matter were now giving her a standing ovation. The irony wasn't lost on Akiko, but she didn't feel arrogant about it. She just felt a huge sense of relief. Her father, standing in the wings just off stage, was crying. He wasn't making a sound, but tears were streaming down his face, dripping onto his shirt. He was clapping his hands together so hard it looked like they might hurt. He was looking at his daughter, not as a child, but as a hero. He knew the sacrifices they had made. He knew the long nights. And seeing this moment, seeing the respect in the eyes of all these people, validated every hard day he had ever worked. He mouthed the words "thank you" to the ceiling, grateful for this moment. Akiko slowly stood up from the piano bench. Her legs felt a little wobbly, like jelly, but she held her ground. She turned to face the audience. The lights were bright, but she didn't squint anymore. She smiled. It was a shy, small smile, but it reached her eyes. She bowed deeply at the waist. She held the bow for a long time, showing her gratitude to the people who had listened. When she straightened up, the applause got even louder, if that was possible. She turned to the judges and bowed to them as well. The silver-haired judge nodded back at her. He picked up his microphone, but he had to wait for the noise to die down before he could speak. He held up his hand, asking the crowd for quiet. It took a long time for the hall to settle. People didn't want to stop clapping. When the room finally quieted down, the judge leaned into the mic. His voice was different now. It was softer, humbled. "Akiko," he said, pronouncing her name correctly this time. I don't know what to say." He paused, clearing his throat. "That was one of the most remarkable things I have ever heard. You have a rare gift. Thank you for sharing it with us." The audience erupted again. Akiko felt her face flush hot. She looked down at her feet, then back up at the kind faces. She felt light, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She wasn't the girl who was laughed at anymore. She was the girl who moved them. She walked off the stage, her footsteps confident now. As soon as she stepped behind the curtain, her father was there. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off the ground in a tight hug. He smelled of soap and old laundry, a smell that made her feel safe. Akiko buried her face in his shoulder and finally let the tears come. They were happy tears this time. She cried because she was tired, she cried because she was happy, and she cried because she had made her father proud. She could still hear the applause from the stage, echoing through the building. It was the sound she would remember forever. It was the sound of acceptance. It was the sound of her dreams coming true. Back in the hall, the people were starting to leave, but they were talking excitedly. They weren't discussing the weather or their jobs. They were talking about the girl with the small hands and the big heart. They were talking about how music isn't about where you come from or how old you are. It's about what you feel. Akiko wiped her eyes and looked at her father. He was beaming, his face wet with tears. He squeezed her hand. "We did it," he whispered. "No," Akiko said, shaking her head. "We didn't do anything. I just played." But she knew it wasn't that simple. She had done more than just play. She had proven something to herself. She had walked into that room feeling small, but she left feeling tall. She had faced a room full of doubters and turned them into believers. And as she walked down the long hallway towards the exit, holding her father's hand, she knew that this was just the beginning. The world was big and she was small, but her music was mighty, and that was enough.